So I promised this morning that there are going to be no silly stories about Jack potty training. Mostly I don't want to have to put another $1 into the Jack story jar. So no stories about Jack this morning, but we are finishing out this series on wisdom. And we've been talking over the last few weeks about first half versus second half living and what does that mean. And this morning we're going to get really into what does it mean to be in that second half. But a quick recap of where we've been. And that is that we can divide our lives up into two halves. The first half is the container, and that is exemplified by Romans chapter 7, where Paul goes into this very lengthy discussion about the law, its purpose, what it does, and how we kind of live with that. And remember that what the law or the container does is that it forms us and it shapes us. It helps us to discover our identity, and it gives us a direction to go. Remember that it was the law that comes to us in the book of Exodus when the Israelites were wandering around in the wilderness, and what they needed was something to form them and shape them. After they had come out of slavery in Egypt, God gives them the law saying, here, use this, it will form you, it will shape you, it will give you identity so that you can have that, so that you can cross over into the promised land. That's what its purpose was. The law, though, is primarily descriptive. It doesn't really build anything. It's limited. Through the law, we know what sin is, and through the law, we can know what is right and wrong, but we don't really know how to fix it. That's that second half living. The second half is exemplified by Abraham. Paul's description of him in Romans 4, which he is just quoting out of the book of Genesis, is when God credits Abraham's faith to him as righteousness. Keep in mind the ordering of this. Genesis before Exodus, Romans 4 before Romans 7. The important part of this is faith. And that's where we are building towards. Now, I'm saying that there's an order in there. Remember, there's no such thing as directionality because the second half living is built off of the first half. So we're going to put everything and spin it all around again. But we have to have that first half living because that's where we are shaped. Paul describes it well for us. He says we are shaped by the law, but we should not be limited to it. Second half living grows outward. Remember last week we described what happens on the cross is that everything becomes very self-centered on that one moment when Jesus is hanging on the cross. But it's from there then that everything goes out into all the world, no longer limited by that law because Jesus has overcome it. Second half living shows us how to overcome the limits that we have in our lives. Now, that can make a pretty decent amount of sense. But if you are confused by all of that, that's okay. Because it is not an easy thing to do. It is not an easy thing to make that transition in there. Because first half living is always necessary. It helps us to grow in needed ways. Through it, we learn how to grow in first half living, and we begin to grow towards a destination even. That is not all bad, because Christian living, if we were to boil it down to just kind of one line, we would say it's this. We know that we are God's people, we get saved, and then we're getting into heaven. There's a direction in there. Now, here's where the trouble comes and why first half living is always limited. Because when we aren't careful, and we do this with lots of things, we say, oh, there's 3 things in there. Wouldn't that be better if it were just 2? We like things to be simpler, to be easier. And so we begin to shorten this down into it, and we say, if I follow the rules, I get into heaven. Fairly broad, general statement, but it's one that is shared by a lot of folks. If we aren't careful, first half living tells us that we have a direction to go. It tells us what forward movement looks like, and here's the struggle. That's not all bad. In fact, there's lots of good parts to that, except for when we use that to put our blinders on. And we begin to be relentlessly focused in that one direction, not seeing anything else around us. That will never get us out of first half living. That will never help us to overcome so many of the struggles and the challenges that we face. Because here's where that begins to be a problem. We're going to, in our recent history, so we're going to say in the last 200 years, which means about 10% of church history, so we're going to go back that far. We have many examples to choose from of things that show us when we begin to put our blinders on and we become relentlessly focused in one thing and dismissing everything else around us. We go back to things that give us more intense blinders, that give us a more containery container, that give us more strict enforcement of the law, whatever that law may be of the time. Here are some of those examples. One of those, in the build-up to the Civil War, we saw folks beginning to question the role of slavery in the United States. That was a good question to be asked, but instead of asking the questions, being open to changing and doing any of that, what we saw was that there were folks that doubled down on the institution of slavery, and they even went so far as at a certain point to begin to talk about God having ordained slavery. Doubling down right in that moment. We can look at another example when late in the 1800s, early in the 1900s, when we were beginning to recognize that alcohol was a major problem in the U.S. and the availability of it, 24 hours a day, and folks were struggling with that, and we were seeing the detrimental impacts it was having. Rather than have big conversations about it, we went straight into prohibition, and we know how well that worked, or never really worked. One that is very common throughout U.S. history is that we look at lots of different folks from lots of different places and we say, well, they aren't like us. We do this a lot. There's lots of examples for this. And we see folks that are starting to act like us or have the potential to act like us. And when it comes up and we, rather than beginning to have good conversations about how to incorporate folks into life, what ends up happening are the Trail of Tears, the eugenics movement, Jim Crow in the South, stricter confines for women, othering. If you're familiar with what othering is looking at an entire group of folks and saying, well, you know how they are. Often the adjectives that are used to describe these folks are lazy, dumb, dirty, dangerous, lots of adjectives you can apply to them. We take an entire group of people and we say, you know how they are. More recently, we still are struggling with many of these things. We have just a whole list of issues. We have abortion, Black Lives Matter, human sexuality. We've already hit on it a little bit this morning. Israel, Gaza, Hamas, Palestine, Iran, all of the Middle East, everything that's going on in there. So many issues in place. We also have struggles with addiction and mental health, and that list can go on. Places where our first response has too often been to more narrowly define our path, to try and make rules clearer, to make entrance requirements more stringent, to provide greater punishments for breaking rules, and so on and so forth. And you can look at that and you can see, well, what's happening is we're pulling those blinders in more and more and more. Until all we see is just this one. We say, well, there's only one solution out of this. And remember, the hard part is, not all of that is bad. Not all of that is harmful. In fact, a lot of it can be very helpful for us. But they don't always serve us well. Because the question becomes, for what purpose? We look at church attendance nationally has been on the decline for many years. That's not really new news, but it's been a thing. So that's one thing. We're recognizing that now and realizing that we need to step out beyond what we thought were the solutions. We're only now beginning to get a handle on mental health and addiction problems. The Middle East is threatening to spill over into a larger conflict, and we're continuing in many ways to have fights and conflicts over many of the same issues that I can remember us having fights and conflicts over from the time I could begin to remember things, which is a much longer period of time than I'm comfortable with sometimes. But even more telling, this is one that's been kind of sitting on me for a while, is that we look at abortion rates in the United States. From the time that Roe versus Wade became the standard, abortion rates peaked at about 1990, and then we started this long, 30-year decline until it started ticking back up in 2019. And since Roe was overturned, rather than seeing the decrease that everyone thought was going to happen, we've seen an increase. despite more and more and more laws having been passed in the last year. Trying to limit or rule, trying to limit, make rules, or blind ourselves out of many of these problems does not work and has not worked, and for good reason. The question becomes, how do we get beyond that? How do we get into second half living that helps us to get there? We start in our reading out of John 8 for this morning. This is one of my favorite verses in all of Scripture, John 8:32. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Jesus, throughout his ministry, is teaching second half living. In this particular passage, the irony in this passage is that he is speaking to a group of folks who are desperately trying to hold on to their blinders and to their limits that they have in place, because they constantly go back and say, Abraham is our father, Abraham is our father. We don't have problems because we have Abraham. You can see, like, those blinders are coming up. The irony is that Abraham was second half living personified. Remember, he was alive long before there was the law, long before there were any of the rules that folks were supposed to follow. It was his faith that was credited to him as righteousness. Like, no, we've got to stay right there with him. Jesus was someone who knew and followed the law, but he was not limited by it. What are our blinders? What are the containers or limits that we have to learn how to go beyond? Speaking in a broader context, there are cultural, societal, and personal expectations that we try to wrap in a religious veneer and then use them as blinders so that we can limit who we are, so we don't have to look outside of anything else. And we think, if I can just hold to this one path, it's going to be good. In Matthew 7, Jesus talks about the narrow gate that leads to life. First half living says that, well, of course it's the narrow gate you have to go into, because you need to be able to follow all of the rules to get into that gate, to know what you're doing, to know where you're going. Jesus says you're getting that all backwards. The hard part about going into the narrow gate is that we have to learn to let go of the limits that we impose upon ourselves or we feel that are imposed on us. First half living leads to the broad gate, but does not take us to the place we want to go. And Jesus gets even more into this. We go farther in our reading for this morning. He says, a slave isn't a permanent member of the household, but a son is. Therefore, if the Son makes you free, you really will be free. Our limits bind us to sin. That's the slavery that Jesus is describing. That's what Paul is describing in Romans 7. I mean, he's saying what the law does is it tells us what sin is. And when we know what sin is, then we are bound to that sin because we know exactly where it is. We know where it comes from. We know all of the things that we are doing wrong. But remember that the law is descriptive. It tells us what sin is, but it doesn't tell us how to overcome it. Here, Jesus is saying, let me show you how to overcome it. Let me make you a member of the household. You can come through this if you are a member of the household and you are not bound to that sin. Let me make you a son or a daughter or an heir, and let me show you what it is like to live in that freedom. Still formed and shaped by what has come before, but no longer limited by it. That's the key. So how do we make this work? I'm going to go back to Jack, not to tell another story because I don't want to put $1 in, but his impact on me, that his very existence changed who I am. Because when you become a parent, you're now a parent. And as parents, or even as adults that have worked with kids, you don't want to mess things up, right? Like we don't want them. You all know what this is. And so we have these sets of laws or rules or whatever it is that we have learned from things around us, from parents or other folks that are around us, and on how it is best to raise kids, right? Well, we live in the information age. And with that has come an entire industry that has developed that is full of parenting help and advice. I put more air quotes on there. And it's hard to avoid. Like, I don't know how they figure this out. I don't know if it's Alexa that's listening in or our phones or whatever it is, but as soon as you are just starting to have kids, all of a sudden you are inundated by all of this stuff. And the rules of this industry are here are the promises of all of that, that if that they tell you, they will give you, this industry will give you the rules for turning your child into a fully functional adult. They will give you the expectations for when your kids will hit certain milestones, and they will tell you where those steps are to take when you have failed in that and they don't hit those milestones. Notice where they put the emphasis on here when we mess up. They will give you recommendations for all of the things you will absolutely need as a parent, regardless of how much money you actually have to spend, including that diaper wipe warmer that you absolutely must have. But what they don't give you is something that would be really helpful, like hypothetically speaking, if you have ever changed your child on the tailgate of a truck. Not that I've done that, but hypothetically speaking, they will tell you how many hours of sleep you should be getting, and the most often repeated piece of advice that I have seen thus far is you should sleep when the baby sleeps. Like the most useless thing that I think I have ever heard. But it gets repeated by everyone. That's what you're supposed to do. They will tell you what bedtime should look like, what their room should look like for sleeping. They will tell you all of these things. And the thing that comes the most with all of this is great heaping loads of guilt and anxiety when you don't meet all of the pediatrician or industry approved rules for how to raise your kid. Right? Parents, we know what this is like, don't we? And the struggle is, there are things in there that are incredibly helpful. Emily and I get the same email every week, and so they're like, whenever one of us is looking at that, we'll send something to the other one saying, hey, did you see this? There are things in there that are great and wonderful and helpful, but how do you overcome the crushing anxiety that it will try to produce in you? We do this in the same way that other things do, because it's not just limited to being parents, it's just the situation I'm most familiar with right now. We take Paul's reminder from Abraham. There is rarely anything new under the sun. Like with kids, somehow we have been managing to have and to raise kids for a very long time before we started getting all of this expert help, right? Remember that Abraham was faithful before the law. Before the law was, Abraham was still faithful. Go back to the directionality part of all of this. What doesn't often get shown in this diagram when we say this is what the Christian life looks like is that we say, well, there's direction here. You start here, you go here, you go here. What we aren't told is that our starting points all look like this. Right? Let me pin this up for you all at home so you can see that a little bit. Our starting points all look like this. We're all starting from someplace different. Forward movement is a myth. Directionality is a myth. Do we want the freedom that Jesus promises us? Then we have to live as a part of the world that we are a part of. And in doing that, we have to take off the blinders. Oddly enough, that lets us relax. Because then we can let go of the burden of the expectations of the law or whatever container or thing it is that is trying to do the shaping that we aren't going to do perfectly anyway, but it tells us we need to be perfect at. Again, not that those things are all bad, but the perfectionism that is demanded by them can get lost. We can see the world and other people in it not as obstacles. Here's what happens when we have those blinders on and we are intently focused on the direction that we're going. Anytime someone crosses our path, they're no longer a person. They're an obstacle that must be overcome. We take off those blinders and we can stop seeing people as obstacles, but we can see them as other people that are trying to make this work just as we are. And it may even mean that we're going to bump into some folks every once in a while. And that our direction is going to change because of it. And that because of the relationships that we make with the folks that we bump into, we may be able to build to something different. All of that is God ordained. All of that is faithful and growing. To say otherwise is to say that I can grow in one direction and that I can just do that. If I just hold to this, I can grow in that direction and I'm going to be fine. The problem is, take a look at these two different statements. We have 3 parts in one and 2 in the other. What's missing in the second one that says, if I follow the rules, I get into heaven is, God's not there. God doesn't need to be a part of that then. Because I know what to do. I can just follow this and I'm going to be fine. But we know that's not how that works. We can't outgrow God. Second half living says exactly that. And that no amount of forward movement or directionality can take us away from Him. We can't get beyond Him in all of this. Even when we feel like we have made a wrong turn, things just end up looking like this. You want to know how long it took me to make that slide? What do we do with this? Let me pull this back up here. Ask yourself, what are my limits? What are the things that are shaping me? What are my blinders? What are the containers in my life that I feel like are holding me in? And remember, they aren't all bad. They just are. They are a thing that's a part of us. Ask how many of them are you following to get you to a destination? Are they moving you? Is that good? Or is it causing harm to you or to other people that are close to you? And the temptation at this point, because I've met myself and I've met other people, is to say that when we start asking questions like that of ourselves, let's flip that back onto what is someone else doing that is causing harm to me and doing all of that. We don't want to keep that with ourselves. Resist that temptation. Because no matter how true that may actually be, there still is only so much that we can do about that. Rather say, how do their actions contain me and limit me? Not because we're trying to place blame, but we're just trying to say, this is how things are. Remember, one of the best parts about the law is that it is descriptive. It tells us how things are. Sometimes we just need to know that about ourselves. And then to all of these, whatever it is we find, begin to ask, how do I find freedom? First, start in prayer. Start in prayer to Jesus, who shows us that the narrow gate even exists that we can go through. And remember that that's not nearly as hard as it's made out to be. If we're living in first half living, it says we've got to follow all the rules. Second half living says we have grace and that we don't have to struggle against those things. We don't have to find that level of perfection that we can't ever attain. Then ask the question, who around me is living a life that is going in a direction that is different from mine? Who am I about to bump into in the craziness of all of this stuff that we're living in? And then continue to pray and ask, who of them has God put in my life so that I can see it differently? So that they can strengthen me and through God's guidance, help me to overcome those limits. Then ask that question, how can I do the same for them? Whose life has God put me into to do that same thing? Always remember that to overcome our limits, just as Jesus showed us, means that we've got to know ourselves. We've got to find that point of being just very self-centered, and not in a bad way, but just in a way that says, I know who I am, or at least I know enough of who I am that I recognize what's going on. But remember, it's from that point then that we can go out. Containers want to define us, they want to shape us, they want to keep us contained, and Jesus says that only gets you so far. At some point, you've got to go out from there. And he says, let me show you how to do that. And that we do that knowing that he is always going out ahead of us. That no matter what direction we're going and no matter how many different twists and turns that we make in life, that he is always that one step farther ahead of us, saying, come in this way, come in this direction, and he will bring us into a new world. Let us be a people that can live in that second half. They can let go of the limits and the blinders that we have. They can be formed and shaped by all that has come before us, but can also go out into the world and know that there is so much more that is out there, and that we are led by the one who came and showed us it's possible. Let us go out and do all of this in Christ's name.